Good morning. This session we're going to talk a little bit about the organization of life. You know from many previous discussions, I think, that there's a staircase of life, I think as we call it, that simple atoms become molecules. Molecules are organized within a cell. Cells organize to become special tissues. These tissues, sets of tissues, build up to a whole organism. Organisms interact with others of their species, as well as all the species around them. That's the ecosystem, which then leads to the greater environment which is on our planet Earth.
Drepung chagyo res ra drepung nal dudul res thana shi drepung chungbo den nyam du ni phungrup su res phungrup ni wangbo ni ani lube mala kengwe che en kengwe rik chi ba imba nyeri khoran su nyam du phinju dewa che dila chongdu lagi res ra ani chongdu dida thana shi nyeri shemba nyam du phinju dewa che ni ngo chi so lan ki shi res an dida koyu da nyam du nuchi mala che de thama de kengwe khola lani jodan di du res themba de.
I'm sure you can imagine the first studies to understand diversity of life on Earth were observational, looking, recording, being careful to see different traits.
Tatanda tsesona nasogi rangshilan shiyura disho ina kranzo tazu tawa inage koryuna la thoya res keda minda mangbuji res.
So it's important to be a careful observer, to carefully measure each other's height, to carefully see how long the tiles are, so that you can group things depending on how similar you think they might be.
Ta keda lan ta du gola keranzo ita toship chidu gola sabsab chin chigu res ta du gola te shawana thanda keranzo ringse supu ringse di che je waras di indu gola ni ruga chigna la khari nyam du sungbe ta khoranzo nanglo ringse khagi sungu dulani dire ni ngaranzo thana shi dogi thanda ringse di cheje di ta ras ringse di.
Megan and I can be classified as European American women because we have many traits in common. Color of our skin, all the things that make us women, not hair length, but we have many things in common.
Megan da ngarang chashana nga Europe ni re ani khwa ari ni res ani tadu gola saja loga imba nei chungbe cha yore special ni ga phume res an thana shi subu di pakwe khado ta na ni ga ka wo res.
Karma could join that group if we include women, both from the Asian ancestry and American ancestry.
Ta thanda nganzo thanda ruga ji soyo radina ngai nyam do chures kharil ta na phime imba che thana she ni nganzo gi lingte Asia da ari gi thanda mebe chi gi imba jura tinzu nyam do dombai na ngar ruga chi na luwe res.
The three of us and you and the people in the village and everyone else could be part of a related group of human beings.
Dilo do ani yang nganzo sum maimba ni keranzo changma nyam do duni yan thande shimmi shimba nyam do chuk res an changma ruga ching na res ruga kharna la na draw milani di rukhana lu sha res.
By looking at traits we all share in common or different organisms share in common, we classify them as humans, dogs, birds, lizards, and so on.
Ta keda minda yores dilate ni an nganzo gi di mi res di ki res di cha res lan di yo chi res.
And that's all Darwin and Wallace did, but with expert eyes and also looking at fossils.
Dilo do ani Darwin do cha sha na Quran chele ba khawa ji cha de de Quran mi phejo shin din zo toship chi res an thana shi kharil ta la na do thanda fossils rigja din zo ta res.
So what's the same about these creatures?
Same?
Yeah, what is similar between them all?
Thanda dinzo kingwe minda mangbush ten do as simje dinzo nanglo la drawe cha khar do sungbe cha.
One thing.
La. Hariyo kuyo. These are furry animals. Migni. All these organisms have two eyes.
Good.
Two ears. Ani pugulas. Chunji dinzo. La. All these babies look similar.
But these babies are born live. This doesn't hatch eggs, or they all are born live and they stay with their mother and nurse.
Diladu amani pu ke jora khatu ki ge res konga tangge yo mares tinjuri de.
How about this one?
Ani di khande khebar dosa gangla. Khartu. Okay, some has horns, some.
Right. But they all have fur or hair.
Tada pula no yorwas thangmala.
This and many other traits allows us to call these things are all mammals.
Ta thanda di khejo dawe chaj do tinjul tani ani nganjogi di sama nuso semchelan othong semchelan di lagyo res.
How about these?
Ta dinjul chashanalas.
What are some things that are the same amongst all these creatures?
Ta dela shtimje shitun do di shina dawe cha hardos. Khariyo mi all khare ngama yore samala dil ngama de ani kangba all these organisms have legs.
Okay.
Ani shimba chudo has snout.
How about
Di kharesa. This is a crab.
yeah, they all have front limbs of some kind and back limbs. You know, like arms and legs. You wouldn't maybe call these legs, but like arms and legs.
Ta di langba da kangba la na disarela sangmala dos simje sangmala.
This one has lots of arms and legs, and this one has arms replaced by wings, but you can see the similarities.
Dila langba mangbulla na digi roas an thana shi di cha sha na langbe sabla ta di kharil gyurela na shokba roas dinala.
Even though these are more different from each other than the four animals on the other side, they're certainly all animals.
Dila this shi di tis kheba res ina ta waina kharla na semje na chugi res di shija.
I think you can feel or automatically see with your eyes that these are more similar than these.
Ta khiran zo ta du khoran ha ho dos dawe dingi la dawe cha manga yo chi dingi dis da che ni dingi durwaina dingi da dos.
We can classify ourselves, but people who are really know all the traits of bones or all the traits of how babies develop within those animals can really finely classify them into very many groups.
Dila de thanda nganjo tawa chamgi dingi da che dingi minda do thungu dos ta kheba do jimba ina quran jo kharchi la ina thanda kheda rere tena rube kheda lata thagana shi quran jo kheda minda ta ni ani shifte ngan ta ni ani quran jo yewa chi gi res ruga loga su gi res.
This structure to classify things was perfected long ago by, I guess, by European standards in the 1700s.
Ta thanda chikdon dunjas la ora thurab chupge dewala ani thanda yewa che shido dingomani chisa res yewa che di.
So this was by a man named Linnaeus, and he made a protocol for how people should classify things.
Di yewa che ngi dusu cha de la na Linnaeus cha de res. Onkorangi todang roji su res khande yewa che gugu yemedi.
The most restricted or smallest group would be, well, we could make it smaller, but a species would be all of human beings who are here now would be one species.
Ta rukha nalta na ta chungsho dola na digdos thanda khari chagor la na ngajo mi ro cha shana mi ro mi ri jora di sama ani nyiri chik na chugi res.
A group of related species is called a genus.
Ani ya nyiri dawe rukha ji sura tinjol khar lai la na gyu lagi res genus la di.
And this gets bigger and bigger kinds of groups. Many genus together would be the next thing, many groups of this would be this, and so on, until we get to like a kingdom, like all animals are a kingdom.
Dila do ani gyu mangbu ji do ani ya kim cha yu res, kim mangbu do ni de mangbu do ni chemba mangbu do ni the mangbu do ni ling cha yu res. An ling la di thanda ngajo ta changma do ni simjing gi ling di cha de res ngara jo sangma tina chu yu res.
To go from a very big group down to a group that is defined by their ability to produce offspring.
Dilo de thangbo chimbo jini gozu anteni ma chung ru res ruga dilo de kharil tagir lo na kebel chie gi thanda bu khagas ki me di niba jora dil tani shay res.
So a person who does these classifications would know by how they looked that these two are not the same species.
다 코란수 이탄다 이어체 줘라 디 이어체 디스에서 해절라 다 디니 차차나 디니 니릭직 마레란 라기 레스 코란수 니릭직 고차기 마레스 디니
Even though these two things look like, boy, these are really different, these two are the same species.
다 디타도 걸라 만드어 스토스 이네 코란이가 가르라는 니릭직 레스
So sometimes you have to look beyond what's easy to see outside and look at paws and brain and eyes and things that are a little more deep than just the outward appearance.
제자니 이어체도 걸다 카브레 칠로니 가리 통구에 메저라 디직불 만드어체 낭팅 사브루 레스 강베스 라베스 옵다 도다 믹다 레바다 디나 마타기 레스 코나수이
So remember, species means that those organisms in that species could reproduce and make offspring that are fertile, that could also keep reproducing.
Dila dugala nyerik chikpa la khandijil lag nyerik lai di khandijil lagu la waina pensu dewa chini kepel chithue gi nibo yo waina tinzula ani nyerik chik res lagu res.
And when we think about evolution, it's the success is that species continuing to go forward as a species.
Dila do ani Quran sugi thanda lamlong chini da thanda pu kepel chejura mithuni chidinge dinjila ani nyerik lagu res.
This is how we sometimes depict a family tree. This man and this woman had 4 children.
Ta kimgyu gi dongbo roji te res dinala ani pala da amla jures dinala ani pugu shi Quran il pugu shi res.
This woman and this man then had another child.
Ta di pumudida ani komorang sandani la ya pugu chi res.
This is the first generation. That child is the second generation from these people.
Ta dini gi do ena thangbo di ta rab thangbo cha de res pugu da andi pugu rab niwa di res.
This man, the brother of that woman, had this woman, and they had 2 children.
Ta di pugu shina ni di chik da Quran dinyam do chansa gya res an Quran ni la pugu ni ke res.
This child and these 2 children are cousins.
Ta phagi phomo chik da di pugu pyu ni da Quran sama har do la pinja du res.
These grandchildren have genes in common with both grandparents.
Ta di chao samo chayu ra Quran su nanglo la rigyu thanda rigze di kharir la na rigze di khaneller la na popo momo ga jin le jo cha do res.
If you look at them, they probably look more like their parents than they look like their grandparents. And their DNA will be much more like their parents than their grandparents.
Ta chi number di ta wa na chao samo di kharida nya chayu kharida da chayu la na susu phama da da chayu res. Ni di popo da momo duru ina ine rigze ta du gala ni phama ga ji rigze di da ro de cha de res kunjuni.
So the more closely related they are in time, the more genes they share with other people in their species.
Dila du tuze chan ta na dini nya chayura phaju popo momo duru ina dila du tuze khagas nya na digas ki ani rigze di thumba res.
These cousins have some DNA and characteristics certainly in common.
Dila du ta Quran zo pinja cha de ra Quran zo nal ta ina ge ya DNA daw cha de res tinina.
But here, look, a whole new set of unrelated genes, chromosomes, traits came from somebody else and is contributing now to a new family tree.
Dila du galta Quran ni changsa ge du di rigze bat manda logash li yora chiloni chi ni le and di kim tanda kim gyu dongbo na churu res.
So it's all a bit a matter of chance and probability, but in general, those grandchildren will have more in common with their grandparents than with the cousins.
Dila du ta khobab da dinde gi chani shi yora sirunga di shedu gala di puni gi tanda rigze ta oina popo da nya popo momo la nya cha thana shi phagi pinja shimbash ta di da duru oina popo momo la thumba res.
Now I'll bother you with some of my family tree.
Ta nge nangmi gi kim tanda kim ju gi tan dongbo di toya is.
Grandpa, father, sons. Grandsons, I guess, of this man.
Popo res, apala res, ani puni di res.
Next slide. Go back one. So these 2 are more similar in height, father to son, than grandfather to grandchildren.
Ta popo da pala chawi radi. Korani da da sugurin se ta ina. Popo da phule, popo da chawni duru ina, popo da phuni da dos sugurin se di.
But he doesn't look exactly like his father.
Ine tadu gala korangi pala da cha cha gyan chibu chikyan yorela na hyo mares.
Although sometimes when they did certain things or smiled a certain way, I almost thought they were the same guy. Next slide. I took this picture when they weren't looking.
Cover Hardilana Zamzam Gimusho down the Indigira, Bobo de da Pala Niga Chibotungu do Staudoji.
Next slide. So they don't know, they're standing like this, the same person almost.
Let's Landan Doba dollars, Kurani, Michik do yours, Palat Pogani.
Same thing.
Chidanda the Chibusikan dos and you go.
This is father and son.
Palada Pures Kurani.
This man lived to be well in his 90s, so I'm hoping my sons get some of that.
Piladita Pobo Chashana and the Loguju Ganlets res, Angara Pugeta Digas de Giriochi.
These two men are both not so tall, but very nimble. Good balance, jump, not clumsy.
The Kurani Suburimbu Shuda Yomares in a career lana Hurbu Laura, then do your Choya, then did shoot Chires Kurani.
So where did those giant, am I a new mutation? And that's where those giant boys came from.
Dilla Duta Ngala Judo Joyanalas near Pudi Suburimbu Charkuni Suburimbu Shadam in Dos.
Maybe he had a giant wife, and those genes went to their grandchildren.
Yamina Korangi and the Pobo Ekime Jura Momodi. Momodi la Rigze Suburimbu Yoy Girigze Diosi Ross.
Next slide, please. Now, his wife's very small.
And Korangi came in la Duta Momo Chawara, Momo Subuchunju res.
Next slide. This is now we get to my family tree. That's me as a kid. My mother, my father, tall guy, like a 6 foot. And this is my brother back here who's even taller.
The ding ara chundu kapsu yisra. And dinge amla the palares, Nepala rimbu doste, fit troops, the child rings the digasures, and pajo dinge jojo and jojo kineres.
My brother's back there because this is a picnic for my father where he worked, which was a brewery.
Dilla Dutat Aratunsa Rojra, Del Lachisa de Latin also Tugi Town de Kapar Gashi.
So my brother's getting all the free beer he can.
Dilla the Nye Chujugita, Miss Hamola Chang to the rest.
Next slide. So for my father, my mother, later on, and me, I'm almost halfway between them.
The dinge pala res, and amla res, and dinga Korani ringseta and a key the chadidos.
Although I look like my father, he looks even more like his father.
Tanga pala the amla tadu pala the todos, and ye pala di tanda Korangi pala le palalta and a tian res.
So I'm farther away in time from my grandfather. I look less like him. My father looked very much like his father, and maybe my boys, the height came from all these big men.
Dila do ani ngara pala da res poponyam do duro enasra, ya pala koram popo da doch ha res. The Tanda Ni Pudi Supurim Buch had the Rizero de Pege Dinini Chungyo in Seres.
Next slide. I look even, this is my sister. So we have the same white skin, crummy. As we got older, everybody needed glasses. We all got really white hair, and we all have the same bad back and aches and pains. My sister and I are very similar.
The Pajodingi Aja Resra. And do study Rauda, Shamdo Couch, and Yerma Tedio, Cheta Couch, the Logedugal, the Chadures, and Gab Nazatan Chetama Dodo Ures Marani.
Next slide. So these are some central concepts of evolution. The closer in time two organisms are, they're more likely, the more close in time they've come from a common ancestor, the more traits they share, the more they look alike.
The Tuesday Chani show in Astra Pelgurban, Kagaski, Neo, and Digaski, any Tandaniri, Dinzo, Kingu, Dinzo, Koranzo.
Every generation, though, is changing a little bit. The more related we are, the more recently we came from this common ancestor. And remember, we think all living things came from a single common ancestor.
Ani tandaji khari sembana shagu urlaoina tanda kingu khandejina sangma and mebuchik ni chung res.
Phylogeny is how we organize evolutionary relationships based on traits that are shared in common.
Ta tanda phylogeny lejura di khari lawolana tanda ngaruzu pelgyur gi goineta ngarazu kheda khari tawe cha chagdu lejura dilatani ani diksha gyo tikzu jura dil lage res.
So this is a tree of animals that have vertebrae.
Tanda di tanda dongbosh to khari ga chunggur lawaina kesi gyunge semje din ju tun res.
Our vertebrae are made of strong bones, but the first ancestor had a material that was a little different, started here. All of these animals out here are animals that are alive today.
다 단다 탈라 고르교 심제인데 된도 디 단데 통화 요 심제된 res 단다 요 res 아니 디 상마 게르 요아체 안 당봉 안쪽에 메보디 칸이 고츠르라와나 데니 고츠레스.
These animals that are alive to have vertebrae, but they're not bony like ours. It's quite different. These are, I think, jawless fish and hagfish, some ugly kinds of fish.
다 게시 용에 심제나 수요 res 디니 이네 ngaranzo 미낭시 루바 타고 덴도 요 마레스 디니 다 냐릭도 아카시 덴도 차교 res 루바 용에냐.
As time went by, this ancestor was changing, and off came a branch of sharks.
다 데네 메보니 마마마 테루 두갈라 안젤 카리 차르라나 샤크 차요 res.
Sharks have a backbone, but it's not made of bone, it's made of cartilage, which is the stuff on our nose up here is hard, right? But here it's wiggly. That's cartilage. The ear is cartilage.
다단다 샤크 지도 디나랑조 미도 루바 요 마레스 콘조 카리 소셜라나 나로디 툼루 레요 디 단나가조 나고도 차션 디 타고도스 디 루바레스 디와 요고 싱이스타 디 툼루 소셜교레스 딘데기 룹샤교 차도레스.
If you've seen a shark swim, he can really be bending very nicely.
딜레도 샤크 던조 추나주도 고게 된조 수부 고게 된조 니바 야고도스.
Ancestors kept going along. This ancestor, which gave rise to the fish, this is where the vertebrae are truly bony.
딜라도 타 당보 데니 고츠라 데니 안젤라 카리리 라나 냐리 딜레레스 딜라도 모네 타 나가조 루바디 루바 요 타 딘데리 차도레스.
All of these branches now have bony vertebrae, and they're now divided by something else. So let's look at something recent where this branched here had a common ancestor, this kept going, now there's two, this one kept going, and now very recently there's two kinds of different animals here.
딜라도 딘 상만 메보칭니 디네 마 야라 퉁구다 딘데 퉁레스 디 메보칭니 야라 니 퉁 타 딜레도 예베타 투주로 차드레스 딜라 니 차드레스 심제.
Here is the common ancestor that gave rise to mammals.
타 디 카리 차드올라나 메보 디 카리 메보 차드올라나 누스 심제라 오동 심제기 메보 디네 차드레스.
Back here, an ancestor divided off. One branch gave rise to animals that include kangaroos, and the other branch to animals that include elephants.
타 디네 니 야라 니 차도 야와제도갈라 찍디 카르친라나 국된 심제란 티다 kangaroo 라디 디 차레스 안 찍디 카리 차르라나 랑친 차레스.
They're classified here, we're in this group. They're classified as different because of how they develop their young.
콘조 예와 가르친 체르라와나 코란조 이부고 살롱 치단 딜르타니 예와 체샤 레스팅인데.
This happened fairly recently. One branch takes care of developing their babies inside their womb.
딜라도 릭치디 부고디 칸데스 냐위르라와나 살롱 치디 수수기 녜나 냐르기 레스.
This branch, which includes kangaroos, have babies that are born very, very immature, not as good as a baby elephant is born.
딜라도 디 인두갈라 살롱 체 차잔 로지다 녜나 차르기 레스라라 디도 요 마리스 파제 국된 심제 단다 kangaroo 차샤이나스 코란조 부기 두갈 살롱 야부시다 마충이 아니 쿠마디나 냐디기 레스 코란조.
It's not fully formed. It ends up crawling back into a pouch that the mother has to protect it.
다 살롱 차잔 드웨롤란 드웨 마리스 체자 아마디 부디 숨겹 체라 단다 쿠마시다 디나라 냐디기 레스 부디.
So it finishes its development in outside, not inside the mother, but in a pouch in front of her.
kangaroo imbaina 살롱 체조라 차자 수 아마디 수분알 치기요라나 치기요 마레스 마튜 아니 치로 단다 쿠마 조라 디나라 살롱 차기요 레스 차상 차디.
So the point of this all is that we can follow and classify animals and make estimates of when they came to be from a common ancestor and how closely are they related.
디 땅아라조 이쳐바도 라오라 롭제 로지 라투요 레스 다 딘조 메보 하네지니 충레스 투조 카가스 충레스 아니 디 심제니 디 카가스 니오 차기요 레스 펠규리 차네 디 아니 세우퉁기요 레스.
You know, I made a mistake. I said all these were around now. The dinosaurs are gone.
뉴드 쇼스노라 스텔라 페나나 단다 요 심제레 라라 디 tumru 딘조 요 마레스다.
But you see, they are fairly closely related to a common ancestor that gave rise to birds and dinosaurs.
이네 케란조 디나 시와이나 세우퉁구도 디 tumru라 다이노소르 디체 디 차리그레도 코라니 따와나 메보치그레도.
This is just another thing. You can see all this lines and branches and fingers coming off. This is just the 3 big classifications, just to see where we fit in. A huge piece of life are bacteria.
Tanda yewa chidu gala zo sum tön she resra. Dinala keranzo thik da yela ro mangbu chtung dos. Ani chimbu chignal zo chignal khari chagir law na zo thasi bacteria du she res dinala.
Another big classification that then has branches are these things called Archaea, which are single-celled organisms, but they have traits that make them different from bacteria.
The yewa che niba jura di cha sha na zo tanda dinala arki thasin len tön res. Di bacteria do yorte ine dinala kheda khashej mindo cha de res kurani lo res.
The other huge classification is everything else. Plants, animals, mammals, peas, little things we can't see that are in the pond. I mean, everything else that's a eukaryote, our cells have nuclei, is in this other classification. This is probably the most simple way to classify things.
Tadi yewa che tab de uji cha de res dinala sumche dos. Tadi ni she sares du sumba dina khare chorla na sishing da semjen da mi da stema da khari ba changma chu res. Dina khari urla na tabung na tadu ningden tabung yo dinde rik changma dina chu she res.
So people do the best they can to observe, classify, maybe when the animal has died, to look at its bones inside. But it's just a model, and it's always being re-evaluated.
Dila duda migi shimju da mangbu chigi yores rupa da di samata gi yores ine kyar ne kyar do thanda di cheship che jora di chibu yores zo.
The knowledge now about DNA allows scientists to actually look at genes, look at the T, G, CAs, and that is in and of itself a way to know how related different animals are, or any organisms are.
Ta thingsan ro cha shawe na ngara zu khaptu DNA nanglo rigze rang ta yores A C T G lan sera sti rang lata ne ani thanda kemwe ni yora soja ni di khabas ni lo khabas re shadil ta ne shetu yores.
I could look at all those notes we passed down, the orange and the green notes, and I could look at them and say, this guy was sitting pretty close to that guy because these 2 squiggles look more similar than from the last person.
Tangela rimuji pe shu lan ten so di tadu gala kiranzo shobu den zol ta oinas ta dida dini kurani nye de sares lan nye she tu sares ta manda oina kurani digas ki tharinga in sares lan desa dil la tu sares di rimudil tani.
So they can look at the DNA of different species and see how related they are.
Dila du tanda nganzo rimudil ta na shi kuran su gi DNA la tani angiri ni di nyelo khagas resha she tu yores.
There's a bit of a wording change here. It says inherited traits are homologies.
Dila dugala kiranzo chik dina kharish sheshela na gunzen tu be kenam la an khungdun kenam la yores la yores.
What they mean are traits between different organisms are homologies. So I have an arm and a bird has a bat has a wing, but they're the same structure, they're homologies.
Dila do keda yan simje ni ni lemenda yong di nigal chikba yong sires peshana ngi lagbe yora di da ani chiu gi thanda shopa jora di nanglo ruba de do cha dures.
So all these 4 animals have arms and legs, and this is really an arm because we saw the bones were similar. This is an arm that became a wing, and legs. So they have, their homologies are that they all have 4 limbs.
Ta dina shio ena thanda chila thungi gi ta lakpa da kangba ro cha sha na shi yo cha dures. Ta dina imba ena du yin di khari cha dorla na shokba cha dures.
But if I found a new animal and scientists had never seen it, they could look at its DNA and look at the DNA of other related things and say, oh, in this animal, this gene says eye color. And in the new animal, they will say that this gene also could mean eye color.
And rigze la ta ni ta shemba ni ni leo ena ge lamsa la tu res ale di rigze di khari tungur la na mi gi khado tungur res lan ya shemba ji ni lemba ena di rigze di mi gi khado tungur ne se u she tu res.
So we say genes can be homologous to each other across species.
Dila du thanda khungtun khenam la jora di ani rigze loga imba ena ge do thoya yo res di kheda din zo.
The more fundamental that gene is to life, or usually it doesn't change much across different species.
Dila do the rigze di khagas ki phendo lawarada so khagas so chimbu chayuna digas ke ni nyeri mangbu na la thoya ga de chadyo res.
And sometimes they can prove that the genes, the products, the proteins that come from those genes do the same kind of work.
Anchik ta du gal khari thungu yor la na rigze chikba chadyor la ra mi gi khado imana khoran so trigger di tunjo jora di ge ni chele chikba chigyo thoya res.
So here's a phylogenetic tree. Some common ancestor gave rise to sharks. This one went on to give rise to fish. This ancestor divided and gave rise to amphibians. These still don't have, they can't cover their egg with a tough membrane, so their eggs have to be laid in water. This branch went on to be able to cover their eggs and then eventually to give live birth and become what we call primates.
Tasanda di sode perim gi dombo di tyen res ra. Dine mebo chik ni ani tanda yela ni chai res chik di tanda nyashin sha che. An di mebo dine ya ni thamni ani shoba yo che. An thana shi di ya mebo chik ni chai res di kamshir ni ne chuya soja din so res. Dinal khari yor law na gonga namju thakpu ju dinde kimu thakpu yo mares chezang khran so gonga di ni chunal tang yo res. An di ro cha sha na thurim soja cha de res.
If we wanted to be detailed, there would be 1,000 more branches to this tree.
Ta thande changma tyong gu na digala khari lir la na yala chikdons thina thie yo res.
Primates are interesting in that they have what we call an opposable thumb. I can put my thumb against my fingers.
Ta thorim soja rola na khran zo khari chi urla na ngojo di lagba dia kyang wa na jugu din so thoya dos loga lo.
That allowed primates to begin to make tools. And because tools then were important, some of the primates developed legs so they could stand up straight and not have two of their hands being on the ground all the time.
Dila de jugu din zo yama yogu che dos dila de thorim soja din zo na din de yoris khran zo lakcha pheju che da din ro go zu res di ani lagba din zo ya subu din zo ya dong dong cha ani lagba ni loga cha ya jora di cha res ya shiga ma zu nduni.
So if we just call these animals A, B, C, and D, this ancestor gave rise to all of them down here.
Ta thanda di cha sha na di mebo chik res mebo di ge ani di changma dini chungre la ni she res.
Likewise, these gave rise to B, C, and D. A is from a different common ancestor, or older one, because this is time going this way.
Tuzu dini go zu res di mebo di dini chungwa ji tung res and di jela dinzu changma mebo di cha de res.
This ancestor gave rise to C and D.
Di mebo di khari tun lo na si dan di ni tun res.
This happened more recently than this, and this has happened longer ago than that.
Tuzu cha ni she na di sar shu cha sar res dine di che dine di ninga du res.
It's very important to realize that it's not like a shark produced A, became B, became C, became D. We did not come from frogs.
Ta thanda dina ta oinas A B C D la ni tuen dos A di B chare B di C chare C di D chare la ni shi yo mares.
It's not like it's a ladder where frogs are below us and we came from them. It's a tree, not a ladder.
Di la dugal di themba do chik di jel di chur lan di shi yo mares ra thanda di tuen du.
And it's not as if D is better than A.
Antana she digi dia tungu yo mares di da A ni durna di ya gar lan di tungu yo mares.
The idea of better in evolution almost doesn't make sense. It's how well you fit in your environment.
Ta pelyu na ke je sho na khandi ya ga ro la jora di samlu di le khro yo mares khais na khoryu na la so kengu di khagas ne thu yo me chone chi thu yo me di ke je shi yo res pelyu na.
So A is not the lowliest, and A did not give rise to D.
Thana shi A di ma sho re ro da kyo sho re da di ke je shi yo mares ani A ni D char lan di tungu yo mares di to dande.
So are these the same tree?
Dongbo chik res din zo.
We have a common ancestor, the oldest.
Ali gonda chua di thanda dini dongbo chik bar re la sta dina ta oina maran zo changma mebo chik roas.
Gave rise to A on both sides.
Ani Quran sugi mebo digi ta dine ni A chung res chung ye kala.
Sorry. A common ancestor gave rise to B, C, and D.
Thangbo go chuk du dir do dine ni A dang di A phaju de chujo ni chung res and dine ani khari chung war la na ani B che C D chung res
And likewise, the common ancestor gave rise on both sides to C and D.
thana shi D me bo chik chayu ra D ge ani C the D D the C cha res chung res.
All they've done is print this so that they're mirror images, like our hands are mirror images. It's the same idea.
Dila dung azu zuguni de phasu chikba thungu da diro ani samju dini chikba cha de res to dang.
So they say that this is in fact the same. You can see the equal sign, that they are in fact the same.
Tatanda dinala di chungda tuen do as di khar la orla na dini chikpa re lagi res.
And we would say that C and D are more closely related than A and D, and so on, because the common ancestor is further back in time.
Tatanda dina ta oina C dan dini nye re lagi res. A dan dini ta C da dini duru oina C da dini nye re lagi res. Kain la no Quran zo me bo ta oina C da dini nye cha de res.
At first, I think many people would get excited. They would be upset to say, I didn't come from a chimpanzee. I'm not a chimpanzee's distant grandchild. And they're right, they're not.
Quran zo kashi karishigo lana nga thanda chimpanzee da deo yu mares Quran gi ta chao samuru la ora da me bo di chimpanzee mare lagi yu res kashi.
But of all the primates, we are most closely related to chimpanzees.
Taine ngaran zo thanda thorim soja shda dina ta oina nyeshu mi di kharida cha de lana chimpanzee da nyeshu cha de res.
And of all the primates will be sharing a common ancestor.
Ta thanda thorim soja mangbu ju ros Quran zo changma ta oina ma theo oina mebo chik res.
Here's a typical phylogenetic tree, again very similar to what you've seen before, and you can just see in time who's more closely related. Reptiles and birds are more closely related than birds and sharks.
Ta perim gi dongbo dil ta cham gi ha ures dinala semjin khari khari nya chagi me jora ta thanda dina cha cha na ta thanda chusen da di cha riksha da Qurani nya res cha da da phaju nya da duru ainas.
Birds are not better than sharks. In evolutionary terms, chimpanzees are not better than frogs.
Ta thanda dinala ngajo thanda pelgu na shewainas cha di nya le ya ga relan dis tengu yo mares thana shi chimpanzee den zo thanda bewa le ya ga relan di shi yo mares khandi ya ga me di tengu yo mares dina.
And you already know in times from Earth's creation how recent all these different species have popped up.
The Keranzu Tanda Tudik the Swim Bas Chego the Chira Dilla Tingudos and the Semje Nirik Mindo among Bushush do the Tuju Kagas Latas Sawachung Medikeranzu Shegi Ross.
On that timeline back there, almost all of this is just in the last few inches on that string.
That and the Tudik Tananzo Kuba the Sura, Dinata and the Nirik Mambushush Ross, this summer hadn't tool and inch Chinjinal Sudos the summer.
These species here in red have died out. They haven't made it to the present day.
Dila do Tanda Dita Gasha Yushta, this Semjenzo, and that's a don't Chinsajures, Tanda Yomares.
Humans dinosaurs were 200 million years ago when they were strong, and then they died. Those little trilobites that I gave you, they kind of ruled the sea about 500 million years ago.
Dila do say Tanda Ngabjas Muela Kazinga Jictus trilobiles, the any Ngoma Sangabjas Muela your rest in Zuride.
So this is trying to show you over time when these different big classifications of animals came up.
Dila do dig Tanda Tudik Roshton the rest, the Karit Yachigur Lawana, Niri Karikari Chumi Majora Dinam Tungures.
Okay, and I always, we can debate maybe later, what do we think our species will look like 1 million years from now?
Tangaranzo Doeguling China Digures, Manzu draw me Nirichda, any million years from now, right? Million or 1,000?
Million.
Okay. That Chida say logic Lotida say Jelani, Manzu Pelguduni draw me the Kandij Yurlani, Manzu Digal Doeguling Jelachina Digures.
So we happen to have a phylogenetic tree with nobody on it.
Tangazu Tanda Perimgi Tanda Dongbojuya, the Keranzul Matame is Dinal Kebujuya Marestinal Tombares.
We happen to have some fake bugs that look similar or different to each other.
In a Tanda Dinal Kariturana
That they're just made up.
Taz Zuma Sushayilas, Mune Yomares, and the Keranzul Matame is.
Some have eyes, some have claws, Some have things in common, some look very different.
Tadugala mandra yo che thana shi ani mi gyu nge da indi ro so cha ni remuten she yo so sha gyu.
These are the ones we're going to say, these are alive today.
Ta khari shi lana dinzo yo re lani khiranjo thanda negab la yo re la jura khadi khadi tam gu gu restin.
These are their ancestors.
And thanda di yo res dige ri di dinzo khar lana khuranjo mebo dinzo chungyu res.
They have some similarities and differences. The current species from their first ancestors.
Di thanda yo so cha dinzo chungyu la ra di mebo res an khurani bara kheba yo res.
So your job is to put the ancestors on the tree and put the related the related alive species in the right groups.
Ta khiranzo di khari digugur lana di perim gi dongbara sha gugura semje khari khari medi ani di khare mebo denzu sha an di dan dewe ani semje thanda yungi khari khari re di ani perim gi dongbana la digugur res.
So this says living and this says fossils. Let's see how we can tell so that you know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The 11 are the living species. The card that has the 10 are the ancestors.
Ta thanda negab ge yore semje yor la jura thanda di pesun shagyo di kharcha gorna dinala chukji du semje. Ta thanda mebo re la jura dinala thanda shobu dinala mebo chutun shas.
So groups will get one of these, and the blank tree.
Ta ruga chik chila khari rag lana chik mebo yo dirwa shobu diragres chik thande nedang la thanda simje yo adi che chik an perim dongbo gi shobu diragres.
So you're going to try to put the right animals at the right spot on the tree.
Dila de khiranzo khari digugu la wana simje khari ni yala hol sha gugu mejura khiranzo digugu res ruga re la dende sum ragrelas chukji yungi di thanda yungi simje cha shalas ra thanda yo marine thega so sha gyo nilas denzo mebo imba cha shalas mebo yungi dil chudu bu.
So we're going to hand these out and give you time to give us the relationships.
So how many in a group? 5?
Whatever they would like. Around 4 or 5.
Ruga chikna la mi shis nga nyamdo lachina digyo res. Yigi mangbu tigyo shda. Yigi mangbu tigyo ningba dosol denzu di khare yurdo denzu chungyo res. Ani yigi megyo thanda par chukji yojo di thande simje yo adi chungyo res las.
Let me try to do this.
If they want it, they can do it. But they should be sure. Oh, yeah. So he's very enthusiastic. All right, are you all ready to talk about this? Let's see how we did.
Ngaranso khandis she magic ta wasta.
So here's our tree where I've just placed the living organisms.
Oh, ta thanda kengwe yo jura. Digi ta matam baina dendi ro so shayos thodi.
Right? So this would be all of those are alive today. And this is going back in time.
Ta thanda gangala remote shado denzo thanda yo cha shay resra. Di mama to na thuju mama to yo tingu res wadi.
So did everybody put these two long ones together?
Ankiranso di digesh digra chego chidugala. Di ringbuni di nyam do shine bes. Yes.
Great. And these three that have no eyes together?
Ani mix mejo sum dollars dinala. Soja this sum dinyam to shine best. Yes.
Let's see how the ancestors fit in. Okay, so there's a few important things that we can see in this evolutionary tree. Alright, so here we have our ancestor of all of our living species. And you can see that over time it diversified into many different species. Some species evolved eyes. Some species got even more simple. So just because something is evolving does not mean it has to get more complicated. You don't want to make eyes and you don't want to use energy to make eyes if you don't need them. If that animal lived in a dark cave where eyes are of no use, don't waste the energy to make eyes. Kesi koyu nagundo mi karmi megosai koyu na nigyo na mi guguyo mares din nebodi pejo ching mares ancheta mi meo dinde yunguyo res. So animals with their natural variation that spent less energy making eyes would better survive in a dark cave and perhaps would eventually evolve to have no eyes at all. Dilodota dinde na chasha na naguna dingi rijora Kuranso dinde chasha na koyu dinde na digyo na Another thing we can see is something called convergent evolution, when the same structure evolves separately twice. So this species and this species both evolved sharp claws. But they did not get them from their most recent common ancestor. They evolved them afterwards, separately, independently. We've seen this happen. Butterflies have wings, bats have wings. They evolved separately. We have seen We have eyes and the squid has eyes, but they evolved separately, so our eyes are very different. Another thing that's interesting in this tree is you can see from this ancestor, these diverged a long time ago, but these diverged not that long ago. In fact, in this part of the tree, there are a lot of new species being made. Perhaps this ancestor wandered into a new environment that had many different areas that these species could occupy. Much like the finches that flew to the islands, the Galapagos Islands that Darwin saw, and they spread out to many different species because there was a lot of different environments they could occupy.
So sometimes evolution evolves new species quickly when there are a lot of changes or different environments to evolve to.
Dilodu kabre nyeri di yogo shu sawa chaya jora di yogo chagi res di kharila rali wala na khuriu la yogo yogo jo aina thana shi nyeri yang yogo minda chagi res.
But sometimes the change from here to here not so much, because this species was very successful in its environment, so it didn't need to change.
Kabre khariu la na phegu dre dini phage chaya jdo nyeri sawa chara di chaya la tuzuringu shu gordoas Kachin ratio ina di roina korang khuriu nesa del korang lamlong chini phegu di kebel ro di yores chezan di juring bunne thu yores.
So when an organism is very successful as it is, there won't be selective pressure for it to change.
Dilo de korang lamlong chini kebel ro di yo ainas ani phane ni nushu chini nushu shira li yo mares duwa doela.
Alligators, we think, have looked much the same way for a very long time. Sharks too.
Tanda choosing the alligator lash da dicha ani shark do yim baina nangamo ne da tujuringu shu do ni koran zo tanda khari yo nang shi juringu shu ne de res juwa shira do ma res.
Okay. Is this all making sense? Do you have questions?
And this seo cha su esa di tiwa yo es di ton.
How did you do?
No. Di toma di. So how did this organism appear? Come from?
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, where did it come from?
How did this come from?
So
From where did this organism come from?
when we show phylogenetic trees, when we show these trees, there are so many species and so much time, it would be impossible for us to fit it all onto one picture.
Ta tanda dende tyungu da perim gi dongbo tyundu gala nyeri mangbu shu ju tsugu restinala. Dila du chigna la mangbu shu changma chu thu yo ma restinala.
So really, this tree continues down much, much, much further with many other branches, eventually going back to a single cell.
Dila du ta di do ma theo na ya di koran la yala mangbu ni di cha de yo cha yo res. Ma the yo res theo na me bo chigla du yo res.
So eventually it would go back to a single eukaryotic cell species, and beyond that, it would even go to the first bacterial or simple cell.
Dila du dene ma theira ma do du gala ningde thapung jiwa thangbo dende rigla li ras. Dene thandi ma theo na ani thasin bacteria yora dende bodol li ras.
But there are so many species on Earth today, we can't possibly show them all on one picture.
Ine ta nyeri mang thani ro thanda an changma parching na la changma tyentu yo mares tuju chigla.
Scientists actually don't even know how many species there are. We haven't found them all yet.
Thana ji cheri bai ta thanda nyeri mindo yora thanga ta oina cheri thanda cheri bai changma nye yo mares khaga sweme di ha yo mares nyeri di mangyo.
Did that answer the question?
An tuwa di length of sesa. Thanda kela tuwa di length of sesa.
Yes. A phylogenetic tree that goes all the way back to the first organism would have so many fingers, it would be hard to let it sink in, I think.
Dila ta chik thangbo de draw na zugu mangbo yo do ji cha shaw na kera samlo na ta shong ma thwe ro chak dos. Samlo tang de khabu ro chak dos thangbo de.
tema tombo de lera. Tema tombo de lera ko kama boya de ane kadene cha ko kama boya de sel de ko jong de kadere.
So this organism walks. So how is this organism able to walk? Where did this trait come from?
Well, these are made-up organisms, so we don't know. But let's pretend that this organism walks.
Tangaras chashas this simje dida khomba jegi yo chashas ra.
It would have come from an ancestor that didn't know how to walk.
Ta digi mebo di kesi khomba ge shingi mewainas.
But that ancestor maybe figured out how to wiggle along the ground like a worm.
Ine ta kurangi mebo di kharir lana khomba ge dang machine ge gujo tang ni ta tnang zo budin zo yogu chi do di chi dang do chi yo ras kurangi.
And maybe parts of its skin that touched the ground began to get harder to make it easier to wiggle along.
Dila do ani sala tu ni gujo tang yo ra di gujo tang ni subu chashi ri jo ra di tis tha ga do ni ani di khomba ge din zo lela ro du yo ras.
And then maybe it would have started to get little bumps on it so that its belly didn't have to drag along the ground as it wiggled.
Thana chita di ne di thuk di rasala tharo ro an de la burbur do cha ra an di burbur cha du kala di to di ani di sala thuk ma go de cha gi ras.
The ones with bigger bumps could have maybe moved a little faster because they weren't dragging their belly along.
Di la du kala di burbur khagas ki che na ani Quran zo khumba ge lela yu ras khaina na thogo di sal thu yu mares.
So the ones with bigger bumps would have been more likely to be fast, catch food, and survive.
Di la du kala ta burbur thunjo che ri jora denzu ri Quran zo nalu ta na che ri di khari la na kyo khumba yoga gya thu ye che thana shi Quran zo se le da din sama yoga chi thu yu res.
So over a long time, perhaps longer and longer, eventually you get legs.
An tuju mama dudu kala an di ring tu na ni kang ba chai gi res. So we say that these organisms, after a long time, they developed these bumps and were able to walk. So why these stones and rocks are not able to walk?
Stones and rocks, are they alive?
The thanda do denzu rik jera do khumba ya tu mundala ra do denzu sembu res.
So stones and rocks cannot evolve.
Cheso yo relas do denzu do gela do sumi ba cheso yo relas do la do sembu relas do mare. No, it's not alive.
So stones and rocks are not alive. So they're not going to, they can't pass on and reproduce and change the species over time.
Chesa Quran so cheso yo mare la ra di inza ani Quran so pelgur tuju ma do do jora an tan shi su ri gyu pe jora di chitu gebel chi yo mares.
You might also wonder, why do worms not have legs? Why do worms not have legs?
An kya jik samgi giras burik judo Quran sol kang ba kharchin yo mare samgu mindues.
It's because of the environment they live in. Worms crawl through the dirt. They want to be small and sleek and be able to fit through the dirt easily. Legs would not help.
Tanda bu kang ba meju rik jo ndi lawor khunzo kharchin yo mar la na Quran so khori khande chil digor lan dam da dinde rik digyo ras dinde kila tanda kang ba meo ena jamshutan ma dre jura subu jamshu chaira di ma dre le la res khori dinde na.
So since legs would not help, they wouldn't evolve them. So sometimes it is better to stay simple.
Dilo du kabre khari la na tab deu yo na ani kheben che yo res ya yo res.
They think the first animals to come on land came from fish, who initially had to come up and take a gulp of air and be on land for a little while and then back to the sea.
The semje thangbo jura nya ro cha cha res ta nya dikha chi la na den lung jura lung na la tanda so lung dile ani sai ga la sa teng la tis de nya pharang ja lo tung den ro ji cha shanas.
Fish whose fins developed, who got, instead of thin, got fatter and rounder, could come up and gulp and get onto land better.
Dilo du Quran so nya shokpa chi do di tisri do cha ni di khar lunga la chong thue che thana sa tengal tisringa de thue dinde juri res.
They were the first animals on land, so there was no one to eat them.
Dilo du ta sai tengla semje thangbo Quran so cha de Quran so la sai ga la sagin che yo mares.
And over incredibly long periods of time, those little changes made arms and legs.
Ani tenjo ta thanda yo dre jura yo droni ani thanda sai ga la de yo dinde chai res ani lagba da kang ba dube di dine ko chu res.
Tani karasa ta tesu ko mipo to so chai mipo chai ro na ani kang ba se na ta ti ma ro mindus tan ni ko mama le ka dan kang ba ni ji se na ro ta ta do ti ni ko kang ba ni chai de mipo me mipo ki ni kang ba ni do
Me bola ho.
iku me ru ta ni mo ro
No del kang ba chik ma shim dos jela kang ba ni cha sha so.
ji lu kuma kang ba ni ji ro 타티 뒤에 아니 대강 죽고 딱 야스 됐어요. 그러다 나는 가르쳐서 고유 코롱 아니기 술 강바지 지야 제지 제용했어요. 안 됐어요.
So we see that the ancestor has only one leg, but later on we can see in the living species we can see there are two legs. So is it because of the change in the DNA structure, or is it because of the environment which caused this change? What is the cause?
It's both. They have to interact. So the environment can only select for changes. So the DNA has to change, and the environment selects which DNA survives to the next generation.
Niga res, kasna DNA koran juat do res. DNA juat do rigze juat do shira, rigze juat do res. Dige ani juat do di ani koryo gi dam she jo chadu res chela. Rigze di juat do an damni koryo di res. Niga res.
So from the genes that we have in this room, we can make people this tall. So selection could eventually make a population where everybody was this tall.
Di la du dam kha chi yoras. Di dam baking gi ani thanda di sodu na ta na sodu rig di chasha na ani di sodu na chama khari chadela na ringbu chadu res.
But to make somebody 15 feet tall, our genes cannot do that. Our genes would have to mutate, get a new gene, a new type of gene to get somebody that tall.
Ta thanda di fit tool has ra. Ta fit chungi chigyo gugur la na di yung marwas. Di khadu chungtur la na ta DNA gi thanda rigze jora di la gyurdo droy na an shini chagyo res shimba yung se yo mares.
But it happens in small pieces. You can see first this gets a little wider. So mutation allowed it to be a little wider. More mutations, it splits. More mutations, they get further apart. More mutations, it gets much more like legs.
Thangbo di kangba chigyo ras. Gyurdo droni tis ya tham swas. Deni mangro tham ni cha an deni ni di tha ring an kangba ni. Gyurdo du chi res na.
단단히 여기 타마지도
Di.
어디 미 요만라서요. 아니 지금뭐 아니 그래서는 안들어서 지금 그렇다는 것은 저다니 미 미어에서 배는 경서 띵띵하는 그래서 이마에 배사되잖아. 아니 그래서 수술한 게 아니 개별 지혜시 그래서는 미 세르세르 줘야게 되는 시에서 아니 다다기도 그래서는 배는 나고 되는 데서 그런 게 비신 되는 점마다 대소선 아니 미와 잘했어. 수조들의 지식에 도시켰어. 지난 가르치는 나보다 되게 가서 여성들이에요. 우리 파랑계는 소양이 치는 빅데이 가르치는 세르세르 되게 물바되는 파랑이 비슷하게 됐어. 이 가르치는 배는
Mada dela micro yo mara. An mixer la na khandes. Micro yo mare la ra.
미초도 요 말라. 아스나는 거의 들었더니 비주에 medyo zaman 배는 나고 나지고 medyo zaman 거기 비주 땅 물어도 되잖아. 아니 미가 잘했어. 아니 유모마 로지는 아니 경서 등등하는 유명한 시작이 medyo zaman 나고 차에서 아니 인데로 이야기 가르쳐서 수사랑 이야기 가지고 나고 되잖아요. 아니 그래서 통화에 미치는 미게 세세로 수속이다. 수고디 디니는 준비했는데 기본적으로 지구에서 디니는 가와로 통하나
Ta thanda dilada micro yo mare la ra. Ta thanda nya le jora. Nya di ani jel ting ting la mi yo mare sra. Mi yo mare thanguni. Nya dila.
미테니 가지고라 세세라는 것을 담기를
Nya dila mi yo mare thangbu thio ndi.
아니 미테니 이스게
Yo ra sondi. Nya dila mi yo res ra. Mi di nobody yagi du res. So in this we say that there are no eyes, and because it lives in a dark environment, it doesn't need eyes, so it doesn't need energy to have eyes, right? So likewise he has heard about a fishes that lives underground, so underwater, deep sea. So he said like there is no sunlight over there, and for its so for its survival it changes, and its ability to see develops, progresses. So it's in contradiction with each other.
So we see two things happen. So in environments with absolutely no light, such as in caves where there's nothing, we see many species have lost the ability to see.
Ta thabu do cha cha inasra
thakbu do in the nagung nagyang ros muna rabet di intu kala ni khoran so bet thoya gi niba me atende jiksi ros nagung nagyang ina.
But in an environment where there's a little bit of light, such as deep down in the ocean, we see some species evolve very large, very good eyes, and we see other species evolve the ability to make their own light.
Ta khashi kharir lawana jasu tingla chasho ina ra dingla ma wala ani nyiri mindo yo ros khashi la kharir lana mi yo che thana shi thongya ya bu yo tinde nibo yongi che khashi kharir lana susu rangi yo twin thunge tinde sosa yo res.
They're very strange looking creatures. They have a thing on their head and a dangle like a lantern almost that they can use to see.
Dila dugala denzo socha denzo kharir lana tadu khenso shu yo res gogalang inde chik thende jo chera kubaroj and digan la chang de yo ro res di chang sha jo dil kharir lana yo tungu res.
I think it's lunchtime, but perhaps we'll show you a picture of some of the cave and deep sea creatures after lunch. I think we'll come back at 3:15.
Ta gyatso yu bet wo la dingi socha da an thana shi thanda thakbu ri jora dinde na dingi socha gi par denzo ani shela percent je la tyo yes thanda shela percent thuju sim sos.